Israel's Lebensraum master plan for Gaza, borrowed from the Nazis' depopulation of Jewish ghettos, is clear. Destroy infrastructure, medical facilities and sanitation, including access to clean water, block shipments of food and fuel, impose telecommunications blackouts, unleash indiscriminate industrial violence to kill and wound hundreds a day, let starvation and epidemics of infectious diseases, along with the daily massacres and the displacement of Palestinians from their homes, turn Gaza into a mortuary. Israel has killed or seriously wounded close to 100,000 Palestinians in Gaza, almost one in every 20 inhabitants. It has destroyed or damaged 60% of the housing. The safe areas to which some 2 million Gazans were instructed to flee in the south have been relentlessly bombed with thousands of casualties. Palestinians in Gaza now make up 80% of all the people facing famine or catastrophic hunger worldwide, according to the UN. Every person in Gaza is hungry. A quarter of the population are starving and struggling to find food and drinkable water. Famine is imminent. The 335,000 children under the age of 5 are at high risk of malnutrition. The some 50,000 pregnant women lack health care and adequate nutrition. Infants are dying in droves. Israeli political and military officials, as the South African jurists documented at the International Court of Justice, make no secret of their genocidal intent, nor of their vision of what comes next. In September, before the incursion into Israel by Hamas and other resistance fighters, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu displayed a map of what he called the new Middle East at a UN General Assembly meeting. Gaza, the West Bank, and East Jerusalem had all been incorporated into a greater Israel. Palestine had ceased to exist. The Palestinians are being forced to choose between death from bombs, disease, exposure, or starvation, or being driven from their homeland. There will soon reach a point where death will be so ubiquitous that deportation for those who want to live will be the only option. Israel is lobbying countries in Latin America and Africa to accept Palestinian refugees. Israeli leaders are calling this deportation, quote, voluntary migration. Voluntary migration is not a new concept in the annals of genocide. In the Warsaw Ghetto, the Nazis handed out 3 kilograms of bread and 1 kilogram of marmalade to anyone who voluntarily registered for deportation. There were times when hundreds of people had to wait in line for several hours to be deported. Marek Edelman, the only surviving commander of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, writes in his book, The Ghetto Fights. The number of people anxious to obtain 3 kilos of bread was such that the transports now leaving twice daily with 12,000 people could not accommodate them all. And Edelman, by the way, repeatedly condemned the Zionist state of Israel, calling it unviable, and supported Palestinian resistance, including armed resistance. The Nazis shipped their victims to death camps. The Israelis will ship their victims to squalid refugee camps in countries outside of Israel. This is the plan. No one, especially the Biden administration, intends to stop it. The most disturbing lesson I learned while covering armed conflicts for 2 decades is that we all have the capacity with little prodding, to become willing executioners. The line between the victim and the victimizer is razor thin. The dark lusts of racial and ethnic supremacy, of vengeance and hate, of the eradication of those we condemn as embodying evil, are poisons that are not circumscribed by race, nationality, ethnicity, or religion. We can all become Nazis. It takes very little. And if we do not stand in eternal vigilance over evil, our evil, we become like those carrying out the mass killing in Gaza, monsters. Perhaps the saddest irony is that a people once in need of protection from genocide now commit it.
So we're here today celebrating the EU's great role in preventative diplomacy. What an absolute joke, when the truth is that the EU has been seriously active not in preventative diplomacy, but in preventing diplomacy. We've had 2 years where the very concept of diplomacy has been smeared as a Russian plot. You've pulled out all of the stops to smash the slightest chance of dialogue in Ukraine. Where was the preventative diplomacy in 2020 and 2021, when at least France and Germany tried to reduce the tensions with Russia, but the EU flung itself behind the US and NATO belligerents? And it's the poor people of Ukraine, with its smashed state, that is living with the consequences of that. Meanwhile, 101 days into the genocide in Gaza, and the EU hasn't even managed to call for a ceasefire, while this report has the audacity to claim that the EU always seeks to reduce the risk of escalation. No, it doesn't. You're fooling nobody. It's time to abandon rampant militarism and stop hurtling down the wrong road of history. Despite the catastrophic death toll it has inflicted, Israel is losing, on the ground and in the court of public opinion. There's no way that this ends that doesn't leave Israel a pariah state with occupation and apartheid on borrowed time, and they know it. So they're doing everything they can. Desperate acts of aggression to provoke a wider conflict with Lebanon, with Iran, with anybody, to draw in the US, to save them from the consequences of their own actions. And as Yemen shows, Butcher Biden is reporting for duty. With Europe's proud genocide by his side, they are the ones who have enabled the continuation of Israeli terror. Without them, it would already be over. So take note, Butcher Biden. The ancestors of the Ireland that you claim to be from disown you. Keep our country out of your mouth. And as for von der Leyen and genocidal Germany, with your words and deeds supporting Israel in the ICJ, not in our name. The people of Europe stand with Palestine and with South Africa. In the past few months, we've seen Palestinian solidarity decried as hate speech. We've seen claims of anti-Semitism being used to downplay the slaughter of innocents in Gaza and to cover up for the legitimate criticism of Zionism. With all of this raging in the background, the EU decides to stomp onto the scene with plans to criminalise hate speech. And the problem with that is, do we trust the EU to define hate speech? And do we trust them to ensure that it won't be used to criminalise legitimate political speech and action? And I have to say, I don't. This has all the hallmarks of another clumsy and counterproductive neoliberal response to a social problem. It's cheaper to criminalise hate speech than to fund and focus on the strategies that might foster tolerance. It's a gimmick to allow politicians to pretend to care about minorities and racism and so on, while doing nothing to protect them, doing nothing to address the structural issues that lead to hate and intolerance in the first place. Structural issues which include centrist politicians dog whistling about migration. So for me, I think, once again, I don't trust von der Leyen's commission to police my speech. So far, the EU and US response to Israeli genocide has been straight from the abuser's handbook, Darvo. Deny, attack, reverse victim and offender. And if that doesn't work, sure, just change the subject. So as the genocide in Gaza continues, you want to talk about everything but Gaza. You refuse to put the item on an agenda stacked with every cliche imaginable, from Venezuela to Iran, with pride of place given to the old reliable Russian interference. So across the pond, Special Agent Nancy Pelosi gives the signal, branding Palestine protesters as Kremlin operatives, and like clockwork, the dark insinuations begin in Europe. Everyone can see what you're doing. It's tedious, predictable. You've been doing it since 2016, and it isn't going to work anymore. The mass movement is focused like a laser on genocide. Everyone knows it's happening.
Last night, a Dublin child of 6 or 7 chanted from the river to the sea. His young voice a heartbreak in a heartbreak week. And thousands stood in angry vigil for Gaza on O'Connell Street. Muslim sisters cherished the hungry outside the GPO, and Big Jim poured scorn on the fools who think that people can be quelled forever with military force, whether in the Stonebreakers Yard or Al-Shuhada Street. And now, of all times, when the powers that be have assembled their forces to scold us as if we're peasants and they are overseers, they tell us that murdering 10,000 children will somehow bring peace. Well, tell them we still won't kneel. Tell them last night Dublin was the Arab street, and we know that if it takes another 800 years, our Palestinian brothers and sisters will read their own proclamation. Their keys will open every rusting lock, and they'll be free. And we know this because truth lies in the streets, and the streets are with Gaza, and we, in our hearts and our minds and our marching feet, are the streets.
The principle of the inadmissibility of the acquisition of land by force, and therefore the illegality of the annexation of any part of the occupied Palestinian territory, including East Jerusalem, which constitutes a breach of international law. And the resolution condemned, quote, Israel's annexation of land, whether de facto or through national legislation. Israel has thoroughly disregarded Resolution 77/126, just as it disregarded all prior General Assembly and Security Council resolutions declaring illegal the annexation of any part of the occupied Palestinian territory and the establishment of Israeli settlements there. These include, but are by no means limited to, Security Council Resolution 252 of 1968, declaring Israel's acquisition of territory by military conquest inadmissible. Resolution 476 of 1980, which reaffirmed the overriding necessity for ending the prolonged occupation of Arab territories in 1980, and strongly deplored the refusal of Israel to comply with the relevant resolutions of the Security Council and the General Assembly. Resolution 478 of 1980, which determined that all legislative and administrative measures and actions taken by Israel to alter the character and status of the Holy City of Jerusalem, and particularly the basic law in Jerusalem, are null and void and must be rescinded forthwith. Resolution 2334 of 2016, which reaffirmed the inadmissibility of the acquisition of territory by force and condemned all measures aimed at altering the demographic composition, character, and status of the Palestinian territory occupied since 1967, including, inter alia, the construction and expansion of settlements, transfer of Israeli settlers, confiscation of land, demolition of homes, and displacement of Palestinian submissions. And at least 28 General Assembly resolutions which expressly condemned Israel's annexation of Jerusalem and the West Bank. Israel has also blatantly disregarded the obligations reflected in the court's 2004 advisory opinion in the Wall case. Since then, instead of dismantling the wall, Israel has extended from a length of 190 kilometers to more than 460 kilometers, encompassing hundreds of additional square kilometers of Palestinian land and incorporating it into the State of Israel. In its advisory opinion, the court expressed concern lest, quote, the construction of the wall and its associated regime create a fait accompli on the ground that could well become permanent, in which case, and notwithstanding the formal characterization of the wall by Israel, it would be tantamount to de facto annexation. And that is precisely what has happened over the past 20 years, not only within the expanded confines of the wall, but all across the West Bank, most of which has now been annexed de facto by Israel. In 2022, the report of the United Nations International Commission of Inquiry concluded Israel treats the occupation as a permanent fixture and has, for all intents and purposes, annexed parts of the West Bank. The International Court of Justice anticipated such a scenario in its 2004 advisory opinion. This has now become the reality. The Special Rapporteur on Human Rights in the occupied Palestinian territory reached the same conclusion. The occupation by Israel has been conducted in profound defiance of international law. Its 55-year-old occupation burst through the restraints of temporariness long ago. Israel has progressively engaged in the de jure and de facto annexation of occupied territory.
Triggering this final phase has completely exposed Israel. It's shown that Israel is deranged. It's not normal. If this was a human being, they would be in a hospital. It's a deranged operation that's taking place. People are deranged. Those young people who are doing this killing, it's beyond imagination. You can understand Palestinian, the resistance of the indigenous people. This is something horrifying, but it is the inevitable final phase of the settler colonial project. But it has a kind of, because of the scale of it, because of bombing, this horrible. As I do in my piece, I show the horrifying nature of the actual bombing. We are revolted by the fact that they have no defense. They call it a war. How can it be a war when there's no defense from the air? And the bombs have been coming down 150 days.
This is 2 million lives who are experiencing what this little boy experienced. The word al-shifa means healing, or to heal, and it's over 70 years old. It is as one of my colleagues, a very senior intensivist said, it is the beating heart. He's a Gazan doctor. It's the beating heart of Gaza's healthcare system. If you want to take out the healthcare system, you take out the beating heart of the healthcare system, and that is what it feels like. It is, it has a capacity of 700 some beds. Many of us have been there. It's the specialty hospital. The fact that hospital was targeted once, and we found no plausible evidence of all of the accusations that were made, that we then proceeded to finally get to the point where we got a Security Council resolution for a ceasefire. We finally got to the point where the International Court of Justice, stated plausible genocide, put in preliminary measures, put in more preliminary measures, to see the world stand by as the hospital was besieged again. The population, including physicians, nurses, patients, internally displaced people, were starved and deprived of food and water for the entire 2 weeks of besiegement. And then to see the horrific photographic evidence of what remains of that hospital and the testimonies of rapes, of executions in the tens of people. I don't know the exact number, but I've heard over 40 to 80 people executed in the hospital. In the hospital. Like, the fact that I'm even articulating these words is so hard to believe. There is no atrocity that will prompt governments to act against Israel. If the world was serious about human rights, about humanity, about all the international To be very frank with you, I am ashamed. I'm ashamed because I'm an American citizen. I pay American taxes, the same taxes that are going towards all of these weapons that are being whitewashed with conversations about aid. This is not an issue of aid. This is a massacre of an entire civilian population under the world's watchful eye. We have seen it happen in our history. We are ashamed that we allowed this to happen in our history. And now that we have video footage, social media, live TV, all of these ways to document what's happening in real time, we're allowing us to do exactly what we did with every genocide in history. And I'm ashamed to be part of a society that is allowing that to happen. And I urge every single viewer on your program today to do everything in their power to make this stop. This is a demise of our collective humanity, and I hope that anybody with an awake conscience watching this hears these words and translates them into action.
People are economically devastated because of the closure of the borders into Egypt and the extreme control of the Gaza economy by Israel. To look at the aftermath of a place where 25 greenhouses had been demolished on the other side of Rafah, destroying the livelihoods of about 300 people, and that had taken place while they rounded up about 150 men, held them under a sniper tower, and shot around them to contain the men, the farmers in the area. I feel like what I'm witnessing here is a very systematic destruction of people's ability to survive.
I am an active duty member of the United States Air Force, and I will no longer be complicit in genocide.